In January 2023, concern about Dayna Isaac did not begin with police. It began with silence. Dayna was 28 years old, a mother of 2 living in Penrith, New South Wales. Friends and family were used to hearing from her regularly. She was fond of calling her father regularly. Messages were returned. Calls were answered. Daily routines rarely changed without explanation. Then, suddenly, they did. How do you solve a murder when the killer is trying to erase the victim? On Monday, January 16, 2023, Dayna's father, Gary English, began experiencing something that felt wrong. Attempts to contact his daughter were unsuccessful. Messages went unanswered. Calls produced no response. The normal communication that had always connected Dayna to the people who loved her had abruptly stopped. At first, there was no obvious reason to panic. Adults missed calls all the time. Phones died. Plans changed. But as the hours passed, the silence became harder to explain. Friends also struggled to reach her. The routines Dayna normally followed appeared to have stopped without warning. There were no explanations, no updates, and no indication that she intended to disappear from the lives of the people closest to her. What nobody outside her immediate circle knew was that concern was quietly growing elsewhere as well. Questions began emerging. Why wasn't Dayna answering? Where had she gone? Had she simply stepped away for a few hours? Or was something far more serious already unfolding behind closed doors? At this stage, nobody was talking about murder. Nobody was discussing crime scenes. Nobody was imagining that a young mother could already be beyond help. To everyone searching for answers, Dayna Isaac was simply missing from the conversations she would normally be part of. And that absence was becoming impossible to ignore. The problem wasn't that nobody could find Dayna Isaac. The problem was that someone already knew exactly where she was. Dayna Isaac was simply a young mother trying to build a future. You wouldn't have recognized her from a headline. You would have recognized her from the way she spoke about her daughters. At just 28 years old, Dayna's life revolved around her 2 young girls. Friends described her as a devoted mother whose children were at the center of nearly every decision she made. When news of her disappearance spread across Penrith in January 2023, those who knew her struggled to understand how she could simply vanish. They knew her too well. You begin to understand why when you hear how people described her. The life of the party. That phrase appeared again and again from friends trying to explain who Dayna was. She was known for bringing energy into a room, making people laugh, and creating connections wherever she went. Yet behind that outgoing personality was someone deeply protective of the people she loved. Her days were structured around ordinary responsibilities. Looking after her daughters. Keeping in contact with family. Maintaining friendships. Planning for the future. Nothing about her lifestyle suggested someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. Every routine pointed in the opposite direction. Then there was her family. Her father, Gary English, remained a constant presence in her life. Their communication was regular enough that when he suddenly stopped hearing from her, he immediately sensed something was wrong. That instinct would become one of the first warning signs that Dayna's routine had been interrupted. The more investigators learned about Dayna, the clearer one fact became. She had plans. She had responsibilities. She had people waiting for her. Everything about Dayna suggested she'd return home. Everything except what was waiting for her. Domestic violence rarely begins with violence. It begins with access. Access to someone's time. Access to their routines. Access to the places where they feel safest. And in early 2023, one of those places was a modest apartment in Penrith, New South Wales. If the apartment could speak, it would tell a story very different from the one visible from outside. Inside were the ordinary details of a young mother's life. Work schedules. Children's belongings. Daily routines. Plans for tomorrow. But investigators would later learn that another story had been unfolding there as well. Dayna Isaac had known Jason Sultana since 2018. 4 years they were friends. Then, sometime in late 2022, the friendship became romantic. By January 2023, however, the relationship was already unstable. Court evidence later described it as not settled, with Dayna making it clear she did not want a serious future with him. You can almost imagine the apartment witnessing the tension, the unanswered questions, the difficult conversations, the growing distance between two people who wanted very different things. Prosecutors later argued that Paul became increasingly jealous and possessive. Evidence presented in court showed he searched for ways to track Dayna's movements and struggled to accept that she wanted the relationship to end. Outside the apartment, everything still appeared normal. Neighbors came and went. Cars arrived and left. Life continued. Yet on January 16, 2023, one neighbor became concerned after hearing an argument from inside the unit and raised the alarm. At the time, nobody knew whether what they heard was important. It was just another sound behind another apartment door. And that is what makes this part of the story so unsettling. How much happened inside that apartment before anyone realized danger was there? What signs were missed? What warnings went unnoticed? The walls weren't talking, but investigators would eventually make them. By January 16, 2023, the timeline began to fall apart the moment Dayna Isaac walked toward her Penrith apartment. According to evidence later accepted by the NSW Supreme Court, Paul Jason Sultana was already there. Waiting. Not for minutes. For hours. Hidden outside the apartment with rope and tape. Waiting for Dayna to return home. Waiting for a confrontation she never knew was coming. And that's where the timeline became disturbing. Because while Dayna was living her normal life, Paul was allegedly planning to take control of it. Investigators later reconstructed movements, phone records, witness accounts, and forensic evidence. But there were still gaps, hours where nobody could fully explain what was happening inside the apartment. What is known as chilling. A neighbor later reported hearing a violent altercation coming from the unit. The sounds were alarming enough that they stood out. Yet at the time, nobody knew a young mother was fighting for her life behind those walls. Then came another unexplained shift in the timeline. Witnesses later saw Sultana leaving the apartment carrying a green Woolworths bag. What was inside? Why was he so calm? Why did he walk away as though nothing had happened? Those questions would haunt investigators. Then investigators discovered evidence suggesting Sultana had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover his tracks after leaving the apartment. Prosecutors later argued the cover-up was as deliberate as the attack itself. And that is where the timeline breaks. Not because investigators stopped looking, but because someone was trying to erase what happened inside those missing hours. Somewhere inside those missing hours, Dayna Isaac stopped being a missing person and became something else. The first clue investigators followed wasn't Dayna Isaac's body. It was fire. And standing at the scene, you would have immediately understood that someone wanted evidence to disappear. Hours after Dayna was killed inside her Penrith apartment on January 16, 2023, Paul Jason Sultana drove her Hyundai from Sydney's western suburbs toward a remote area near Cranebrook, several kilometers away from where she had last been seen alive. Prosecutors later told the court that he deliberately selected an isolated location where the vehicle could be destroyed without attracting immediate attention. Then the car was set alight. But here's what makes the story stranger. The burning vehicle wasn't the end of the journey. After the fire was lit, Sultana used a bicycle to travel away from the scene and eventually made his way back toward Penrith. Investigators later reconstructed portions of those movements using witness accounts, forensic evidence, and digital records. The journey itself raised an obvious question. Why would someone need to destroy a vehicle after an ordinary day? Because vehicles tell stories. Fingerprints, DNA, blood, fibers, phone data, travel history. Investigators know that when someone burns a car, they are rarely trying to destroy the vehicle itself. They are trying to destroy what the vehicle knows. As forensic specialists examined the burned Hyundai, they began noticing signs that the fire was not accidental. The blaze had been deliberately set. And instead of eliminating evidence, it created a new investigative pathway. Every liter of accelerant, every burn pattern, every movement connected to the vehicle began pointing investigators toward the person responsible. Then another disturbing detail emerged in court. Sultana had allegedly taken his mother to the apartment complex after the killing, introducing an entirely new layer to the timeline investigators were building. The cover-up was becoming almost as important as the murder itself. And suddenly, the burned car wasn't hiding the crime anymore. It was exposing it. The fire didn't erase the truth. It pointed investigators directly toward it. When Paul Sultana brought his mother back to the Penrith apartment, she was confronted with something she never expected to see. Dayna Isaac was dead. According to evidence later presented in court, Sultana wanted help moving the body. Instead, his mother refused. Faced with the horrific scene inside the apartment, she walked away and contacted police. In that moment, the cover-up began collapsing. By the time investigators arrived, they were no longer looking at a missing person case. They were standing inside a homicide scene. What they found told a brutal story. Forensic evidence showed Dayna had suffered multiple injuries during a violent attack inside the apartment. Prosecutors alleged Sultana used several weapons during the assault, including a knife and other household objects recovered during the investigation. Medical findings revealed the violence was prolonged and extreme, supporting the prosecution's argument that the attack was deliberate and sustained. Then came the digital evidence. Phone records, location data, internet activity, and communications allowed investigators to reconstruct Dayna's final hours almost minute by minute. Every deleted message, every movement, and every attempt to conceal evidence became another piece of the puzzle. Witnesses helped fill in the remaining gaps. Neighbors described disturbances from the apartment. Friends and family spoke about Dayna's fears and the deterioration of the relationship. Prosecutors also introduced evidence of Sultana's previous domestic violence against former partners, arguing that his controlling and violent behavior had not begun with Dayna. Piece by piece, investigators rebuilt a story someone had tried desperately to destroy. The prosecution's theory was simple. Sultana could not accept losing control and responded with lethal violence before attempting to hide what he had done. By the time the case reached court, the picture was complete. The only question left was whether a jury would see it too. Sultana has been accused of confessing to the crime while in custody. He allegedly told someone that he wanted to tie Isaac up and make her regret playing him over, but ultimately killed her. On December 19, 2025, nearly 3 years after Dayna Isaac was murdered inside her Penrith apartment, Justice Peter Garling delivered the final chapter of the case. Paul Jason Sultana stood before the NSW Supreme Court to learn his fate. The judge described intimate partner violence as a scourge in a civilized society and condemned Sultana's actions in the strongest possible terms. The court heard that Dayna's final moments were filled with fear, pain, and what Justice Garling called sheer terror. Sultana was sentenced to 44 years in prison for Dayna's murder. He was ordered to serve a non-parole period of 33 years and will not be eligible for parole until 2056. The sentence reflected not only the brutality of the killing but also the extensive efforts Sultana made to cover up his crime afterward. The court also heard that after he was found guilty in September 2025, Sultana attempted to harm himself in the dock by cutting himself in the arm with a concealed razor blade. Court officers and corrective services staff rushed to provide first aid before paramedics transported him to hospital. For Dayna's family, however, no sentence could undo the damage. Her father, Gary English, described Dayna as his princess and his best friend. He spoke of the constant phone calls they shared every day and the bond that had defined their relationship. He told the court that every morning felt like reliving the day he lost his daughter. The greatest loss was suffered by Dayna's 2 young daughters, who will grow up without their mother. Throughout the trial, one theme appeared again and again: coercive control, possessiveness, jealousy, an inability to accept rejection. Investigators concluded that Dayna's murder was not a spontaneous act. It was the final escalation of a mindset that viewed a partner's independence as something to be controlled rather than respected. That is why warning signs matter. Controlling behavior is not love. Obsession is not love. Possession is not love. Dayna Isaac wasn't remembered because of how she died. She was remembered because every attempt to erase her failed. Violence can take a life. It cannot erase a truth. Subscribe for more real cases where investigators rebuilt the truth from what someone tried to destroy.